And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Taking a look at tonight's weather, high pressure continues over the central and southern part of the state, and light winds all the way up into the Yukon Flats. Blizzard warnings, winter weather advisories continue for the eastern North Slope, eastern Arctic coast. So the blizzard warning there for Kaktovik and Barter Island actually through tomorrow afternoon. And gusty winds with some snow here in the northwest. Central eastern Bering Sea, Aleutians pretty good except increasing winds here. Western Aleutians of that front that edges eastward tomorrow and weekend, especially in the southern portion as the main energy slides up to the north and northeast. Gusty winds along the northwest coast, Chukchi Sea, western Arctic coast, improving winds, diminishing winds, and improving visibilities for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. Light winds, variably cloudy over the interior, mostly clear, southern Alaska and the Panhandle with pretty good winds as well. And for Monday, 3 big H's here on the map, keeping the area pretty good. This front now pushing northeastward, kind of breaking in a little farther to the east, but not too much farther. Dry for the Arctic coast, North Slope due to that south flow off the Brooks Range, but rain and snow, warmer temperatures here over the northwest part of the state. That trailing edge of that front brings some moisture across St. Lawrence Island, probably in the form of rain, but the southern Bering Sea here, light winds, dry conditions. Same thing for southern Alaska, Kodiak Island. Coastal water forecast for the south coast of the Panhandle. North winds tomorrow, 20 to 25 knots. Northeast 20 to 25 for the central and north coast, but gale warnings, Lynn Canal, north winds 35 knots, seas 13 feet. Gale warnings also for Stevens Passage, northwest winds at 35 knots, Clarence Strait, northwest at 20. And the outlook for Monday, Lynn Canal, north winds 30 knots, gale force gusts, Stevens Passage, gale warnings continue for northwest winds at 35 knots. Clarence Strait, a lot lighter there, northwest at 15. Along the south coast, north at 15. Central coast, northeast winds 25 to 35 knots. And the north coast, north to northeast at 20 to 30 knots. Prince William Sound, Sunday, northeast winds 15 knots. Seas 3 feet. Cook Inlet, north winds 15 to 20 knots. North at 20 for Kamishak Bay. Small craft advisories for the Barren Islands, north winds 25 knots with seas at 5 feet. And for Monday, Cook Inlet, northeast winds 10 to 20 knots. North winds 20 knots for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. Northeast 15 for Prince William Sound with 3-foot seas. And mostly north winds 15 to 20 knots for the North Gulf Coast with seas 5 to 6 feet. Kodiak Island, variable to north winds 15 to 20 knots for Sunday. Alaska Peninsula, northeast at 15. Bristol Bay, northeast winds 15 knots, seas 3 feet. And for Monday, variable winds 10 to 15 knots for the Alaska Peninsula, seas down to 2 to 7 feet. East at 10 knots for Bristol Bay. Kodiak Island, north to northeast breeze at 15 knots, 5 to 7 foot seas. Eastern Aleutians, east to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. East-southeast 15 to 20 knots for Adak and Atka. And then we got gales coming in with that front tomorrow at the highest. This is definitely a high-end wind forecast here. South to southeast, 35 to 45 knots, seas approaching 20 feet. And then on Monday, lighter winds, south to southwest, 15 to 20 knots for the western Aleutians, Adak and Atka. Southeast, 15 knots. Eastern Aleutians, east-southeast, 15 to 20 knots. And the southwest coast for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, light easterlies tomorrow at about 10. St. Lawrence Island and the Yukon Delta coast, south at 20 knots. Southeast 20 for the Pribilofs. St. Matthew Island, northern Bering Sea, south at 30 knots, 15-foot seas. Gale warnings here for St. Matthew Island for Monday, southwest 35 knots, seas just under 20 feet. South at 20 knots for the Pribilofs with seas just under 10 feet. South 20 here for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, small craft advisories for the Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, and Norton Sound there for south winds 25 to 30 knots. And gale warnings tomorrow for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast to go along with that blizzard warning there. West at 35 knots, diminishing to 25 knots on the east central coast. And the central coast, all westerly winds at 25 to 35 knots. West at 15 here for the central coast. And southeast winds at 25 knots for the western Arctic coast. And then south to southwest, 25 to 30 knots for the Chukchi Sea. Then on Monday, good gales here for the Chukchi Sea, south to southeast winds 40 to 45 knots. Gale warnings now for the western Arctic coast, south of 35 knots. South winds 25 knots for the central coast, and those winds stay southerly and diminish, much lighter now over toward the east side. They're down to 10 knots, sea subsiding to 2 feet.